Welcome and thank you for joining us today for Enterprise Network Automation, emerging from the dark ages and reaching toward NetDevOps. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Our featured speaker is Seamus McGillicuddy, Vice President of Research covering network management at EMA. Seamus has nearly 2 decades of experience in the IT industry. His research focuses on all aspects of managing enterprise networks, including network automation, AOps-driven network operations, multi-cloud networking, and WAN transformation. And before I hand things over to Seamus, I wanted the audience to know that he will be wrapping up his presentation today by taking your questions. Feel free to log them anytime by using the Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email from EMA with the on-demand playback, as well as additional information about this new research report. So I hope you'll check that email out. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our featured speaker, Seamus McGillicuddy. Seamus?
Hi, thank you, Raleigh, and thank you everyone for joining me today. So I'm here to talk about my network automation market research. Before I get into it, I just want to acknowledge the 4 sponsors who financially supported the research, made it possible. Obviously, they don't get editorial input into the report. They don't get to provide input into what I'm going to talk about today, but they do get their logos on the screen and some other stuff. Yeah, so I wanted to thank the 4 sponsors of this project, all of whom obviously play some role in a network automation strategy for an IT organization: Efficient IP, IP Fabric, NetBox Labs, and NetBrain. So the agenda for this webinar: I'm going to talk briefly about why I'm doing this webinar and why I did this research and how, the research goals, methodology. Then I'm going to talk about why network automation talk a little bit about why network automation continues to be so hard. It's a big problem, big issue that I can't really cover in one segment of a webinar in totality, but I will talk about some of the challenges that we see in the research and also benefits that people experience when they actually pull off some sort of successful network automation strategy. And then I'm going to zoom in on a couple things that are hot topics in network automation and appear to be important based on what we're seeing from the research itself. The whole idea of a network source of truth. What is it? How do you get it? Why is it important? And validating change is made through network automation, which I think is very underrated and very hard to do for a lot of organizations based on what we saw here. And then we'll close it out with some final thoughts and some Q&A. So first up is research goals and methodology. I've been exploring this problem for a while. I think this is the 3rd time I've done some market research on network automation over the last 9 years. And things kind of continue to be stuck. The problem just isn't going away. People are trying to automate. They're not happy with what they're doing. And we see new startups emerge. It's a cycle. New startups emerge. They attack certain problems in the world of network automation with a lot of innovation. Or and they're attacking some old problems. They might see some new problems they hadn't identified, that people hadn't really conceptualized as a potential product solution in the past, and they go after that, such as source of truth, validation. We also see new open source projects that continually can emerge to fill gaps in the commercial market. Some of those open source projects then become productized in some way. We've seen startups emerge around open source projects. We've seen companies like Amazon buy some startups that emerge around open source. We see new industry conferences launching to explore why network automation is still a problem that hasn't been solved. I can think of 2 that have started over the last year or so, like AutoCon and NetDevOps Days, which I think have merged and generated a lot of buzz and a lot of conversation. And a theme that I see over and over again in my conversations and in my research data is a lot of IT organizations continue to have do-it-yourself projects where they're just building automation rather than buying a commercial solution. We think like in most other aspects of network management, people are buying commercial products for things like performance monitoring and troubleshooting, things like that. But when it comes to like putting together a network automation tool set, there's a lot of DIY out there. So why is all this happening? What needs to change, and what are some potential paths to success? In terms of what we did here, we surveyed 354 IT professionals who are involved with network automation in their organizations. And we also interviewed 10 enterprise network automation experts who'd be quoted extensively in this presentation and in the report that we published yesterday. They are all working for companies that I guarantee you have, at least one of them you have done business with in the past. There's at least one company here that if you've ever watched a television show or watched a movie, you've done business with that company. There's, maybe you drove a car made by another one. Maybe you ate food produced by a third. And they are all going to be quoted anonymously, though, which is why I'm being vague. You can see here just the demographic information or highlights of the people that were surveyed. You see a lot of mix of network experts, executives, cloud people, security people, DevOps people, tool-focused people who are, tool engineering and development people. And I think there are probably about 12, 15 industries represented, but these are the big ones on the chart. All mid-sized to very large enterprises. Anyone that worked for a company that generated less than $100 million in annual revenue or had fewer than 1,000 employees were kicked out of the survey. It's transatlantic, North America and Europe represented in these countries you see on the screen. And so lots of technical expertise, a lot of management expertise, very wide range of types and sizes of companies. So challenges and benefits. Only 18% of the 354 people we surveyed rated their network automation strategies as, quote, a complete success. The rest were expressing some degree of dissatisfaction. I think maybe 54% said a partial success. And then the rest were like uncertain or actually admitting to failure. Here on this chart, on this slide, you see on the left the business challenges that they most frequently cited as issues they're facing, and on the right, technical problems that they most often see. So on the left, you see IT leadership issues. So the CIOs and IT executives around the CIO are not setting the right agenda for how they are going to automate the networks, and perhaps they're not actually setting the right policies in place to actually use those automation tools once they get deployed. I often hear about network automation getting implemented and then no one or people don't use them as much as they're supposed to. They do workarounds for certain tasks, like, oh, I'm not going to go to the tool to get this data. I'm going to go to CLI to get this data. Staffing issues. We don't have people that know how to write software for building it on our own, or we don't have right people to evaluate and implement network automation solutions from vendors. Budget issues, big problem, no surprise there. Conflicts and collaboration between groups, either between different groups within the networking organization or across IT. Like, oh, we're trying to build automation to provide self-service to DevOps, but it's really not working. We don't communicate with those people well, and they don't want to, they think our APIs are garbage or whatever. And then security policy constraints. Oh, we want to use this open source product from this vendor, but our security team says, hey, this is open source. You can't use this. Things like that. And then on the technical side, you see integration issues. Like, oh, I need to integrate my network automation with my IT service management solution for ticketing and change management, or I need to integrate it with the security policy tool that we use so that it can implement so that like security and policy is enforced through automation. But that's integration isn't working. 25% are also dealing with lack of standards. A lot of people I talked to one-on-one told me they just can't standardize their networks for a variety of reasons. And when you can't standardize your network or create a standard for your network, how do you automate to your network? How do you automate a network when you don't have a standard to compare it against? Legacy infrastructure issues. We have old switching vendors, or we have old switching platforms that just have terrible APIs, or we can't. Our tool doesn't support this version of this OS from this vendor. And we have 6 different versions of this OS from this vendor for very specific reasons that have to do with politics, change management controls, and feature requirements. So, and the network automation tool only supports the 4 newest versions. And then too complex or difficult to use. We've implemented tools that are just really hard to use. This requires some coding and scripting capabilities that not everyone on our team has, and so not everyone is capable of using this automation tool. So lots of problems, and change management, which you think about as like the whole point of automation in a lot of ways, is not the issue. When we ask them what are the network features that are most important to your organization, change management is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9th on the list. What they're really focused on is like, I want to be able to do like security policy lifecycle management through network automation, like policy design, implementation, audits. I remember talking to one guy that I was interviewing one-on-one for this research, and he says, we get like hundreds of tickets about adjusting policies on our firewalls per month, and it's really hard to automate that because it's very complex. The process to automate policy changes on firewalls is much different from the process that we use for managing change on switching and routing and stuff, and we haven't really figured out how to deal with that. Config compliance, monitoring, alerting, enforcement, like making sure that the standards that we've set for configuration are enforced and there's no drift, and if a bad change is implemented, it can be reversed. And then network validation and assurance, being able to understand how a change that we're going to push through automation is going to impact the network. And also, how did that change go through? Did it go through successfully? Did the network behave as we expected once that change was made? Or did we screw it up somehow? And then incident management, they want to automate troubleshooting, correlation, remediation. These are things about like much more than just like managing moves, adds, and changes. Here's some peer perspectives on some of the challenges that people I talked to were dealing with, which in some ways illustrate what was on the previous couple of screens. On the upper left-hand corner, you see an IT tools architect from a Fortune 500 media company who's telling us that it's really hard to find the people that are needed for this. It's easy to find people who can automate and find people who are network engineers, but it's hard to find people who understand both of these worlds very well. And it's very hard to convince, as he said, a developer who's like a software developer to focus on networking when there are other things they can be doing, like AI, for instance, or DevOps. Like that's where all the hot stuff is happening. And network engineers don't always want to learn how to be developers, and developers just don't want to work with networks. So he's facing that challenge. On the upper right-hand side, a network automation engineer with the medical school and hospital network says that it's a collaboration issue. They might be working on a problem and trying to come up with a solution to automate an issue that people need to solve, and then something comes up in conversation and they realize that someone else is already working on it, and they're both working in parallel on the same issue because there are silos within their networking silo. A tools engineer, the Fortune 500 in the lower left, Fortune 500 retailer, says it's all about the standards. I mentioned that earlier, like when the network is not standardized and the data is not standardized, you don't have a standard way of generating inventories and a source of truth. You can't automate at scale because you're forced to automate one device at a time. I can push a change to this network because I can push a change to this switch because I know how that switch, I've looked at that switch, I know how it's configured, I know that it's behaving as intended. Now, when I I want to automate a change through that switch, I can do it, but I know that every other switch around it is a snowflake, and I can't push the same change to it because we haven't standardized. And then on the lower right, this network engineer mid-market business services company was his main gripe when I asked him what he's dealing with is like his switching vendors have terrible APIs. It's not necessarily that it's legacy switches that he's dealing with. Even the newest switches that he's got from his vendor, he doesn't like the APIs because he feels like networking vendors are trying to, there's a competing interest between having an open API and revealing commercial secrets or differentiators within their platforms. And so they don't want to share too much information about how they've done certain things. And so he can't automate all that he wants to automate because those APIs are not as open as they should be. One of the benefits that these people in our survey experienced when their automation is going well, the two big ones are operational efficiency and reduced security risk. So skilled personnel are more productive. Every conversation these days talks about how it's hard to hire and retain network engineers and find people, not fire them, find people that know how to do very important high level network engineering. And so when you have operational efficiency, you can drive more tasks down to tier 1 personnel and allow the network engineers to spend more time on difficult problems. The other one's reduce security risk. Saw that one of the most sought after capabilities in a network automation tool right now is being able to manage security policy life cycles. So it makes sense that they see that this is a reduced security risk opportunity if that's what they're trying to implement in their tools today. And then you see lots of secondary ones like improved capacity management, just overall resiliency of networks and applications and services, and just accelerated incident response. Mean time to insight, mean time to repair is faster, and increased and improved collaboration both within your network team and across teams. So we're going to talk about build versus buy. And what the reality is that I see is that most IT teams are building and buying. I remember having conversations with a couple of network engineers a few years ago who they're both telling me in separate conversations that they had bought an SDN solution from their networking vendor for their data center, right? So I won't say which one, but they bought like a solution that created basically the equivalent of an overlay over a network to supposedly automate and streamline service management in a data center network, right? And both of them had written software to automate the SDN controller to some extent. And I was thinking to myself, why are you doing that? Why did you hire somebody to write software to automate something that theoretically back then was supposed to be an automation capability? And that's just one small piece of it. Like there's just so much DIY activity going on. In this survey, 94% of the people we surveyed had some kind of DIY network automation effort. 57% of them told us they were using open source tools that had no vendor support, just stuff they had downloaded and started implementing internally. And another 64% additionally told us they're internally developing network automation tools. These are not one-off scripts. We specifically specified in the survey questionnaire, like this does not include one-off scripts that you have written to do the specific individual task. This is about automation software. Are you creating automation software? 64% said, yes, we're doing that. And we also put in a caveat saying this automation software that you're writing internally could be using some kind of open source component like Ansible or NetBox, or maybe just some Python libraries could probably also be included in that. And then 100% of them said they had a vendor-based network automation tool. 59% said we're using an open source tool that's supported by a vendor. Almost the exact same number said we're using a proprietary software from one of our networking vendors, our switching vendor, for instance, or our Wi-Fi vendor. And then 43% said we're using a proprietary network automation software from a tool vendor, a vendor that specializes in providing network management tools or just network automation tools in particular. On the right, you can see most lean one way or the other. 69% said that vendor-based solutions, whether they're vendor-supported open source or internally developed, are more prevalent in our network automation strategy than DIY tools. Just 10% said DIY rules everything, and then 21% said they had a healthy mix of both. Like both are very important to their automation strategies. But the big takeaway is almost all of them are doing both to some extent. So why is that? We asked, why do you have a DIY automation tool? 36% said, we're trying to align the functionality of our network automation strategy to our specific network. Like I remember having a conversation a couple years back with someone who had written their own network automation software. They had multiple data centers, and each data center had like a different type of network fabric in it, or topology, or control plane, or whatever. And at the time that he was trying to shop for network automation tools, he found that no single vendor supported all the different types of networks he had across his data centers. This was like, think of it as like a colo provider, smaller, mid-size colo provider. And like, so he just wrote his own tool, and he was saying, if I could go back in time, I think I would go commercial at this point, because I see some vendors that are offering broader capabilities now, but it's too late, sunk cost. So that's a big driver. And then 36% said, we just have security and compliance requirements. Like we don't trust commercial vendors to touch this aspect of our network automation strategy. 31% said, we're just trying to save money. 26%, closing gaps in commercial tools. I was talking about an SDN vendor that two separate network teams were writing software to automate. And then the 23% said roadmap control is very important. So you see these quotes. One guy at a mid-market business services company, he says, I request budget for network automation software and I don't get it. So I use a lot of open source. That probably rings true for a lot of people. Network automation engineer at a $3 billion SaaS provider. I'm pro build your own because you get more flexibility. You also get a lot of savings, money again, and you build up your skills by building your own product. So he's seeing it as an opportunity to just be a more advanced engineer with a lot more to offer his current employer and future employers. And then on the right, someone at a large university, very large university, says, we try to stay away from software vendors because we don't want to get locked in. Also, I don't think a software vendor can come up with one orchestration tool that can fit everyone's needs. Now, he comes at that from the perspective of a IT organization for a university, where or a central network engineering team for a large university, where a lot of individual colleges and departments have their own like independent approach to networks, and like have different expectations for how they want to consume network and infrastructure and services. And so like he views that as like, I can't adopt a network and automation tool that can be that can be used to automate networks in all the different ways that the organizations I support want to consume them. And he made it clear that he understood that some enterprises, network teams might have more centralized control and might be able to get by with a commercial tool. So 100% of you are consuming commercial automation. Why do you do that? 36% said, well, we have security and compliance requirements, which I think was the number 3 reason for doing DIY. But here, it's probably for a completely different reason, which is we don't want open source software. We don't want homegrown software on this aspect of our network, because open source, we just don't think it's secure. Homegrown, we think it could be sloppy and lead to errors and open up vulnerabilities. Platform requirements. We need something more scalable. I want to push a change to 10,000 routers at once, and my internal team developed a tool that can't handle more than 50 simultaneous changes. Depth and breadth of functionality. Usually, from what in my conversation, when the team builds a network automation tool internally, they're usually attacking like one or two use cases that are like biggest sources of pain. And then they build, if they're doing it right, they can build out more features on that platform over time to make it more comprehensive. But that can take years. Whereas if you buy something from a vendor, it's usually pretty full featured. It's not going to have 100% of what you're looking for, but it will have maybe 80% of what you're looking for. And that means faster time to value, which is actually another one here, like just being able to deploy something faster. But in that case, it's usually like not just like breadth and depth of features, but just being able to get it up and running quickly. We don't have to wait for you to write it. It's there, regardless of how broad the feature set is. And then better cross-team visibility into data. A lot of times you want to be able to provide visibility to multiple teams into the network automation solution so they can see what's happening. They may not, it may be hard for people outside the networking team to interact with the system in such a way that they can get the information they need for a variety of reasons. So for instance, this network automation engineer on the left from a $3 billion SaaS company says there's some things you can't build on your own, especially if it touches multiple groups and multiple systems. And he was talking specifically about IP address management. Like he wouldn't want to write an IP address management software internally because there are so many people that are interacting with it from different groups to manage IP address space or like sending requests to it. And he wanted something commercial that could work well with like a ticketing system or have strong APIs that could plug into some sort of DevOps platform that would allow DevOps team to get IP addresses for servers as the VMs as they spin them up, things like that. And then on the right, you see commercial support, not something that was listed in the top 5 responses, but this one network automation engineer at a Fortune 500 food and agriculture company really talked about how the members of his team are not developers and they don't want to be developers. And when something goes wrong, they want someone they can turn to. And he's a network automation engineer, and he was actually very early in his process of building out his company's network automation strategy. And he was leaning commercial because of that, even though he himself had development skills, I think. He knew that like commercial support would be important in the future. You see up above here, successful teams, people who told us that their network automation was more successful. They called out breadth and depth of functionality as a top priority. And they also cited something called cultural preferences, which just like their network team had trusted vendors they liked working with, or were used to working with a vendor because of the whole idea of commercial support and things like that. So that was something that could potentially be a best practice, just like adopting commercial tools for aspects of network automation that will be well received and well implemented by the network team that you have. So now let's zoom into a network source of truth, which I think a lot of people are on this webinar have probably been looking into and talking about and trying to implement. You can Google what is the source of truth. This is a definition I just cobbled together. It's an authoritative record of network intent and network state that enables automation and network operations in general. So it has data, and it can pull data, and it has multiple features on top of that repository that we'll get into in a second. Basically, whenever you're trying to make a change to the network, you need to understand what the intent of that network is in terms of like design standards, golden config, security policy, so that when you are implementing a change, you have all the data you need in order to make sure that the change complies with the intent your network has, or your organization has for the network. And then you also want network state there, perhaps, because you want to understand how those changes impact the network. And you want to understand if there's any drift from what you intended the network to be. And so the ability to pull like config data from the production network and be able to see if that lines up with your intent can be very important. You can identify unauthorized changes, for instance. 80% of the people in our survey told us that they think they have a network source of truth. Then we asked all of them, not just that 80%, we asked them like, where do you collect, store, and maintain the information that would be in a source of truth? Based on the definition we presented to you, where is that data? Source of truth or not, where is that data? And 22% claimed that they had a central platform for all of it. Now, is it a good central platform for all of it? Like, can you have all this data in one place? A lot of people will tell you no. But 22% of them said, yes, we have it all here in this place. 62% said we have multiple systems of record that are integrated in some way, either directly or we have some sort of federated system, like maybe a central platform that's pulling data from multiple places all the time and exchanging data too. And then 15% said we have multiple siloed systems of record. So they're not integrated. I'm logging into this, I'm logging into that, I'm logging into this, pulling what I need, consulting what I need in order to do what I need to do. And then 2% said, hey, it's incomplete. There's a lot of this information that would be in a source of truth. I can't even get at it. Like there's this one guy, he's got an Excel spreadsheet and he doesn't let anyone touch it. There's this other guy maintains a wiki of some kind and he won't let me touch that. And also, 40% of my DNS I can't log into because it's someone else's, someone else owns it, et cetera, et cetera. The security team owns this and they won't let me touch it. So I ask them for information and sometimes they send it. You'll see like a little bit of a correlation here, like the top two, 22 and 62%, they add up to 84%, which is pretty close to the 80% of people who claim they have a network source of truth, which is not entirely coincidental. The data kind of shows a correlation there. But we won't dive into that too much. Let's just say that only 20% of the people in this survey who told us they have a source of truth, which remember was 80%, 20% of those people say that their source of truth is completely effective. On the right, you see a network automation engineer with a $3 billion SaaS provider. I'm not 100% satisfied. It was quick and dirty, something to get out the door. It takes too long to pull data from it, especially on larger sites. And then a network automation engineer with a medical school and hospital operation. There's no one perfect tool for a source of truth. There's always something we'd like added to it. I'd like easier reporting from it, and it's not a click and run tool, meaning it's not something productized, not something easily used by everybody that needs to use it. We saw that when people have an effective source of truth in place, they tend to automate a higher percentage of the tasks for the networking team. Because in this survey, we asked people, could you estimate how many tasks you're automating on a daily basis overall? And the higher that percent, the more satisfied people were with their source of truth, the higher that percentage went, which means that if you have a good source of truth in place, it apparently leads to more effective and more highly adopted and more broadly implemented automation. Also, they also told us that it was easier for them to understand the differences between their intent for the network and the current state of the network, which tells you that they got they've found a way of implementing a source of truth, whether it's a federated system or a so-called centralized platform, that can show them both and compare them both state and intent, which is nice. And then people who told us they had a good source of truth also told us that they tend to validate more of the changes they make to their network before they implement them and after they implement them. We are making sure these changes are good. We're verifying that these changes are good. A network source of truth helps us get there. People who told us they had an ineffective network source of truth were more likely to tell us that their network automation strategy was plagued by slow or non-existent returns on investment in network automation. If you don't have a good source of truth, the data here shows that it's not going to pay off, potentially, or it's going to take longer to pay off. We asked people, what kinds of features do you look for in a source of truth. And it's really about having data quality and authority, something that is authoritative and the data in it is good. And also it can enable security policy lifecycle management, which came up during feature preferences in a network automation solution. So again, security policy lifecycle raises its scary head here. You must manage security policy. And so if you have a source of truth, it's not just about having golden configs and design standards. It's also about having the ability to compare what changes you might make in network configs to how that might impact, and being able to model how that might impact your security policy, for instance. And then secondarily, everything else is basically secondary, from data reconciliation and accurate data models and network models, all the way down to like having good APIs and integrations and extensibility and customizability of the network model. So we know that we need a better source of truth. We know a little bit about what that source of truth should look like. Let's talk about validating change, which in some aspects is enabled by a good source of truth, but it's more than that. So what is network change validation? It's known by many other names, depending on who you're talking to. Like I've seen network assurance is a term used to describe this in some contexts, network verification, network compliance, or network compliance analysis or monitoring, or digital twin, like establishing a digital twin of your network will help you validate anything, right? It confirms that a proposed change is good before you commit it. It also might confirm that a committed change was successful after you did it. In this survey, 98% of people told us that their network automation strategies included tools and or processes for pre-change validation, and 99% said they also had tools and processes in place for post-change validation. In terms of pre-change, 58% said we have some kind of network modeling software or a digital twin simulation of our network for validating changes before we do them. And those people tended to report more success with network automation. 52% also said they're doing some text analysis or manual processes around pre-change validation, which is less ideal. And then 42% said they're emulating their networks in a lab or a virtual test bed, maybe using like old hardware or running like network operating system containers in a lab, virtual lab. And then on the right, you see a Fortune 500 retailer, network tools engineer, telling me we have some containers we run in a lab to check changes and also some custom scripts, but it's not a full topology of our network. It's just a reference model. Like that's not a complete process. Like if you're going to push massive changes through your network, that's not going to be enough. And then on the bottom, you see a network engineer from a private gaming company. Many of you have played his games. We have some validation, but not enough. I would love to know if this change will make my traffic move in a different direction. Also, when I upgrade this device, what will happen? No one can solve that in a container lab. We also ask people like how often you validate changes. Like, do you validate all of your changes, 90%, 70%? And we found that if they are more consistent with validating all changes before they make them, they reported they're more likely to report a successful network automation strategy. So more frequent pre-change validation correlates with network automation success. So you need tools that can allow you to validate more of the changes you're making. If you're using text analysis and manual processes to validate changes, you're not going to be able to scale that. Like if you're doing large scale change with network automation, you can't rely on manual processes. You probably can't rely on a container lab either. And then post-change validation, there are fewer additional options for this, not necessarily good ones always, but so again, the most popular approach here is using that network modeling software or digital twin, pulling state data from the network, and that one correlated with more success. On the right, by the way, you see a network automation engineer with a Fortune 500 manufacturer who told me that validation is very tricky. It gets cumbersome to say without any doubt that the change had the effect I intended. And he was probably working in one of the most sophisticated environments that I looked at in terms of all the people I talked to one-on-one. So 45% say, oh, I just do a manual config check. I do show config on this switch. And yeah, that's what I've put in there. Okay, good. That's not going to give you a full picture of how the change impact your network, though. 44% said, well, we're doing proactive traffic monitoring analysis. I see, I'll look to see what kinds of changes happened in traffic patterns after that change went through. And, oh, well, now there's some congestion here that wasn't there before. Oh, on the positive side, the congestion that we were dealing with is gone, and that means that the change had the intended effect, at least for now. And then 44% said 44% said reporting alerts from a source of truth. So they've got a source of truth that compares intent to state, and that can it's pulling data from the network and saying, well, based on our model, this is good. And then 35% said, well, we wait for alerts from our monitoring tool or tickets from our end user support team, which is not great. So your way of validating a change is no one is telling you that things are on fire. Okay, that's good, I guess. But maybe like if utilization on your network improves by 10 or 15% and at Christmas, then you're going to know the change might have actually been bad all along. Oh, and by the way, more frequent post-change validation correlates with automation success, just like pre-change validation did. So, final thoughts. I've been talking a lot, but I feel like I haven't covered everything that was in the research. And probably haven't answered all the questions that you might have. But what we do know is network automation remains an unsolved problem for, I think it was 82% of the enterprises in this survey. Both DIY and commercial solutions have merit. Most companies have both. And incidentally, our research showed no difference in perceived success between people who focus on DIY automation versus people who do commercial. Both of them are having, there is no statistically significant difference in success between those two paths. And also, most of them take both paths to some extent. But what we do know is a source of truth is essential. And there are many paths to take to get to a source of truth. People who told us that their source of truth was effective also told us that their overall networking automation strategy is successful. That's not really shocking. We also saw that, they tend to understand differences between network intent and network state more readily, and they are able to validate more changes that they push through automation if they have a good source of truth and other things. And they also told us that if they don't have a good source of truth, they're struggling to get ROI from their network automation investments. So it's an essential thing to think about. There are a lot of ways to get there. There are products, there are open source tools. Some people are trying to deploy centralized platforms. Other people are trying to create a federated system. It's not quite clear what the best approach is at this point, but it's something that you need to invest in. Network validation also ensures success. We saw that the more you validate changes both before you make them and after you've done them, the more successful you tend to be with network automation. There are a lot of people who are still relying on imperfect approaches to this for a variety of reasons. But it looks like people who are doing network modeling software or network digital twin software are having more success. And we also know that change management is not the problem that people are solving right now. I mean, NCCM products came out like ages ago and did a pretty good job of solving change management, but it wasn't just about change management. It's about understanding what change does to you and whether that change is good or not. And, not just based on the standards that you've set, but what the model of the network is. Like what does the network look like? What will the network look like when you make the change? That's what people need to know about, and they need to extrapolate that to things like security policy as well. So people are focused on solving bigger problems like security policy lifecycle management. They're also focused on solving config compliance management. Like I need to make sure that my network is compliant at all times with my design standards and my configuration standards, and I don't want that drifting. That's what they want to focus on. And they also need help with validating changes, like knowing that change is good and knowing that the change went through as expected. Those are the things they're focused on. So as I said, I couldn't really talk about everything that was in this report. In this, it's like a 60-page document with like 50, 60 charts and graphs in it. We went deep. There's, hundreds of, well, maybe dozens of quotes, additional anonymous quotes from the people I quoted in this presentation, and also just lots of deeper dives into everything that we talked about here and other things that we didn't even cover here. So this is a link to that report if you want to check it out. I think some of the sponsors of this research have also purchased distribution rights to different versions of this report, so you can find that out there on the internet as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Raleigh for questions.
Great. Thank you, Seamus. Let's jump into the questions we've received. The first one is, what makes a network source of truth effective?
Okay, so we did talk about what the features were that people wanted, right? I think we saw, well, the people who told us that their source of truth were more effective, they told us that they did tend to have a higher focus on being able to manage security policy through them. They also were more likely to tell us that the whole process of gathering data that you need before making an automated change is more automated in itself. Like you're not like the less manual data gathering that you do, like, okay, I need to go into this Excel spreadsheet to get this one piece of data before I make this change. The less you're doing of that, the more effective your source of truth is. That tells you that you've been able to successfully pull all the data that you need into some sort of system. They also told us that they had very strong multi-vendor support. So, I've got multiple networking vendors and I need a source of truth that can work with all of them. They also told us that they had a source of truth that had good integration with other systems, especially IT service management, security monitoring, and DevOps automation. Those were the big ones. And then they also told us that their overall network automation tool set had strong support for being able to collect network intent data, discover and report on network state, and discover and report on differences between intent and network state. So those are the things that we saw that were correlated in our data with a good source of truth.
Thanks for those insights, Seamus. The next question is, your research suggests people are using a lot of tools for automation. Is this a problem?
Not necessarily. In my research, I've always encouraged and seen indications that that consolidating tool sets is pretty important in network engineering operations. Like the more tools you use, the sloppier things get and the harder it gets to correlate things across tools and screens and stuff. But in this research, the people that had larger network automation tool sets told me they were having more success. So that tells me that I think some people are composing network automation solutions across multiple vendors and multiple technologies. And you're seeing some integrations and partnerships with some vendors that sort of fall into that, like source of truth vendors and network validation or network modeling vendors, and things like that. And just, network automation vendors who focus on like pulling together a lot of tools and a lot of scripts. And so I think it's probably going to depend on your strategy. Like maybe if you are trying to automate, if you're trying to build out like a centralized tool, it doesn't make sense to have like it might not make sense to have like one or two like little open source tools here that you use for select use cases. That might lead to like poorly documented processes and things like that. But I think as long as like all the vendors you're using and the tools that you build internally or or open source tools you use internally have good APIs and you have good support on like getting things to work together, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have a lot of tools. But if you got a vendor that's got terrible APIs and poor customer support, it might be an issue. And also, think about it from this perspective. Like most of the people in the survey, like they were focusing a lot on automating data center networks and automating cloud networks, but many of them were also automating like switching and Wi-Fi in their campus environments and SD-WAN, like doing more automation in their WAN, and things like that. So there's lots of different domains, and it might be hard for you to automate all of that in one or two tools. You might need a third tool for this and a fourth tool for that, just because like it's not just one big network, it's lots of networks that are, working together to support your business. So that's also something to keep in mind.
Thanks, Seamus. How do you think generative AI tools will impact the network automation going forward?
So in a lot of ways, it depends on what you're talking about with generative AI. Like I talked to one guy last year. He was like a VP of infrastructure engineering at a company, and he told me that he had 12 or so network engineers working under him, and all of them were paying for premium ChatGPT. And also he told me a lot of things. One thing he told me was like, I wrote a one paragraph, like a 50-word prompt for ChatGPT, asking it to write me a very advanced routing configuration, and it generated it in seconds, and it would have taken me 2 hours to do it. And then he had a caveat there, like I had to go through that config and like change things here and there, but so that was an example of automation just with ChatGPT, right? Premium ChatGPT. And then you're seeing more and more vendors using generative AI to interact with their systems and provide sort of a conversational interface for you. And what you're seeing early on is, well, I am going to retrieve this information for you. You want to know how to, how to config this switch so that it does that, or you want to know what our reference design is for that as a switching vendor. Well, here it is. And then further down the line, you'll see, and you're already seeing to some extent, like, well, I want you to make this change. I want to make this change to my network. Please do this. And it does it. That's emerging. And also on the operational side, like, oh, can you tell me why um why 20% of my users are having problems connecting with the Wi-Fi network in Colorado or whatever. And it will return some theories and some prospective fixes, which is also automation of incident management. So that's all happening. I'm actually planning some research specifically on that topic, and I'm going to be kicking that off in a couple months. So stay tuned. It's going to be about applying generative AI to IT operations, and I'm going to be looking for sponsors of that research. So if anyone wants to sponsor that as a vendor, please let me know. You'll be hearing from us. So thank you.
Thanks, Seamus. What percentage of enterprises have dedicated DevNetOps teams, and what is the trend around it?
Well, I can't answer that question because I did not ask it in this research. Like, I do know that, you know, and I think like maybe like 2 or 3% of the people in this survey like identify themselves as net DevOps engineers. But that's not really a definitive overview of like how many net DevOps teams are out there. I did not ask them that question. What I did ask them was, are you doing DIY network automation? And 94% said yes. Now, I would say that um, I out of the 10 people I interviewed one-on-one, I'd say like 8 of them were really focused on homegrown or internally developed or DIY automation. And of those 8, I would describe maybe 2 or 3 as like net DevOps type people. So there's an anecdotal view of like the people I interviewed one-on-one.
Thanks, Seamus. Let's take one final question. This audience member wants to know more about AutoCon, the conference you mentioned. I don't know if you can shed any light on that.
Did I even name it right? I think it's coming up in let me just make sure I got it right. AutoCon. Yeah, AutoCon 0, Network Automation Forum. It's looks like it's in November. No, that was November 2023. So the first one was in November of last year. There's another one coming up in Amsterdam soon. I can't remember when. Just Google it, you'll find it. And then I think there'll be another one in the States later this year. I plan to go to that one. I missed the first one because I couldn't make it fit in my calendar, but I'll be at the next stateside one.
Well, thanks for sharing what you know about the conference, and I wanted to thank the audience for taking time out of your schedule to join us. As I mentioned, you will be receiving a follow-up email from EMA with resources from today's event, so I hope that you will check that out, and I hope we will see you at a future EMA research webinar. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.